So we'll go through that roof framing yourself at home. What we're going to cover today are these others, and I'm going to start with trussed roof framing and then work our way back. So we've got trussed roofs, pitched roofs, then a few wall framing pictures to show you, some timber versus steel wall framing. So any of you that have driven around modern developments would see that on some sites you've got timber frames going up, on other sites you've got light gauge steel framing going up. They're both, well, I say, they're both different in their qualities and what you prefer, or what the builders also prefer and their capabilities. Then we'll go into timber floor systems. So timber floor systems are getting used less and less these days. The reason they're getting used less and less is because people do prefer to have a concrete slab, prefer to have that thermal mass and that solid bedding of the building. And also within South Australia we have very movable soil. We've covered that previously. The concrete raft slab deals with that movable soil very well. A timber suspended floor doesn't work very well with that movable soil, because as soon as you get some areas lifting up, there's not a great deal of torsional strength within a timber floor, and so they can twist very easily and you start getting doors jamming, etc. Another reason we don't use a lot of timber suspended floors now is also because of the advancement of steel framing and the ability of the steel frame providers to provide a very quick, easy, put together solution that they will cover all the engineering of themselves. So you can send your house frames to, also your house plans to one of these providers like New Tech Systems, and they will do all the engineering for that flooring system and provide you with all the information you need for council approval to move very quickly ahead, which saves a decent amount of money and time. So as opposed to you as a drafter having to do that engineering with the timber floor yourself and then employing an engineer to do the footings, etc., based on your soil profile, you can get it's a one-stop shop. So for residential architecture, typically we have two choices in roofing. We can break it down into really two choices. One is what's called conventionally pitched timber framing. The other is called trussed roofs. And trussed roofs are also quickly, I wouldn't say replacing conventional pitched timber framing, but they're by and large becoming the most used type of roof. Once again, it's a similar scenario as with the suspended steel floors, in that it is really quick and easy for building designers and builders to do that. And there's a great deal of design flexibility with trussed roofs. The major difference with the trussed roof is you don't have any internal load-bearing walls, so there's no points of support inside the building, and that gives you a great deal of versatility with your floor plan inside. Other major differences are that you can send, once again, you can send your house plans to your truss manufacturer. They will design that truss layout, they'll do the engineering for you, have things prepared for council, and then those trusses can be manufactured in a factory off-site. When they get to site, they can, if they're small, they can be handled into place very quickly, or if they're large, they can get craned into place very quickly, and you have a roof that comes up incredibly quickly. So it is very, very quick on site, and it's also very cheap now as well. So these manufactured trusses are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to produce. One of the students in my other class is building a house at the moment. It's building, I think it's around 200 square metre house or so. I think his trusses came in at less than $12,000. So less than $12,000 to frame up a whole roof. That's getting really cheap. And that's because these truss manufacturers, they can buy the timber in bulk. They've got their systems in place to be very efficient with that timber, so any small offcuts they tend to use again. So there's very little wastage, and it all happens very quickly within a controlled factory environment. So that's very hard for conventionally pitched timber frames to compete with that. So we'll quickly get into the trussed roofs. Now, just as a bit of a guide, does everybody know what I mean when I say timber truss? And don't be shy if you don't know. Luke, Anthony, timber truss? Timber truss?
I'm trying to sort of get in my head what I'm thinking that it is.
Yeah, okay. All right. These are some examples of timber trusses. Now, a timber truss is something that is a structure that works all in itself. Actually, that's a really bad example. Actually, but so this is a very good example of a timber truss. We have top chords, we have bottom chords, and then we have webs inside there. So to make that a little bit clearer, so our two top chords, our bottom chord that joins those, and then we have webs in between. All of those chords and webs are joined together with nail plates, and they make that piece of framing work together as a unit. So this is our conventionally pitched timber frame roof, and we'll go through that in a little bit. But each of these pieces do end up working together, but there's a great deal more flexibility in this type of frame. What we have happening with our trussed roof is if we were to have, let's say, a wind load coming this way, like this really strong wind, it's going to want to deflect that top chord in that fashion, puts this guy in compression, which tends to deflect that bottom chord slightly, puts that one in tension, which will put a deflection load on that, which will put this one also in tension and that one in compression. So all of these members end up working together. So it is a mildly flexible unit, flexible in very small degrees, but the idea of a truss is that it all works together. And because it all works together, that means we can have an external support and an external support, and anywhere in between, we don't require any support. In fact, what we don't want is any support. If I were to go, all right, I'm going to build a wall here like this, and I fix that wall to that, it's all locked in solid. When I get that wind load on there, it means that this member won't be able to move. There will be no flexibility in that member whatsoever, and none in that one. So that one can't take the compression, that one can't take the tension. All the load ends up being concentrated in this section here. So by doing that, I end up concentrating loads, and I increase the chances of this truss failing by providing support under it. So trusses are members that have to work in and of themselves. So they have that desired flexibility of not requiring any support in between, because they're designed to span from one side to the other. So all of these scenarios that we see up on the board here are various forms of trusses. So I don't know what cathedral that is, but it's basically some form of Gothic cathedral with some very ornate, intricate trusses. Once again, down the bottom here, some very solid trusses with timber dowels to join the webs into the top chord. So I imagine they're going to be used as feature trusses. Up the top here, what do we get? Well, we've got once again, some very intricate feature trusses happening in there. That's more essentially sort of design around engineered timber, and it was almost like timber portal frames, etc., but utilising some of the concepts of trusses. This one down the bottom right-hand side is your conventional trusses that you would see in residential architecture. So just a quick run through. With the evolution of timber framing, starts out using simple timber members to span a distance. And timber has its limitations. So it has its limitations, well, the timber that we can buy from the timber supplier has its limitations in it, that it can only be 6 metres long. That's the cut-off point for the timber manufacturers, and that's dictated partly by the size of trees, etc., and what's easily handled, what can easily be handled. But even if we go out selecting trees ourselves and chopping them down, also there are still limitations in those sizes. And one way we get by those limitations is by employing the conventional timber pitched roof timber framing methods, and also by producing trusses. So a very traditional approach is to use that skillion roof, and this is something which is still, it's what is old is new again. That process of, or that aesthetic of having skillion roofs. So does anybody know Troppo Architects? Aware of Troppo Architects? Yeah. So a couple nods. Yeah. So I guess they're known for their skillion roofs. They were an architect, like a pair of architects that started up in Darwin and did a bunch of projects there, and then they opened up an office back here in Adelaide about 10 years ago, and they've sort of brought down some of those ideas from up in Darwin, which is really lightweight framing or lightweight appearance of buildings with skillion roofs, etc., and also something called twisty roofs, which is basically a skillion roof with a twist in it. So that's just rafters that are graduated on a slope, and then the steel sheeting in front of that. But this skillion type roof is one of the simplest forms of roofs we can do. We have very simple elements. We have our rafters and then our purlins on top of our rafters, spanning from point of support to point of support. That has its limitations using natural timber, in that we can only get certain lengths of natural timber, and if we have a log, so this is a lovely big log, probably this bit of revision from last week, we can only get one really big piece of timber out of our log. The rest of the log has to be smaller bits of timber. So we're restricted to getting those really large bits of timber that will span from one point to another point. The way we get around that, if we're just using single members as rafters, we can use engineered beams, so LVL, etc., like we covered last week, laminated veneer lumber. So that's a whole bunch of thin pieces of wood all glued together. They end up being very strong for their dimension and can span very large distances, and make skillion roofs with large open spaces possible, again, without huge expense. But back to our trussed roofs. So they're designed to span between external walls, factory made, have to be installed in accordance with the Australian standard 4440. So that Australian standard sets out predominantly, well, how an installer of the trusses has to go putting them up. The reason we need to know that standard as designers is that it also gives some limitations as to what we can do, and also it sets out what the type of things we need to be looking for on site. We won't get too heavily into that today, but I do suggest you look at that in your own time. Australian Standard 4440 can be designed for most roof shape, preferred for simple designs, rectangular with gable ends. So gable ends, I think everybody here knows what a gable end is as opposed to a hip end now. So gable end, that means that we'll have that triangular shape right at the end of our roof. So if we were to produce a rectangular building with a triangular shape at the end. That is incredibly simple for trusses. We have all the same trusses all the way through, except for the last two on either end, which are slightly shorter than the others, and we have outriggers which go underneath our purlins that go out to form that gable end. And I think we've got a mock-up of a building in there I can bring in to show you how that gable end is formed. I'll just have a quick look. No, that one's got a hip end on it, unfortunately. So I'll just quickly give you a bit of an idea. So it's our long, skinny, rectangular building. This is our door, our window. So it's in elevation. We've got our gable end, which extends slightly past our building, let's say 600 millimetres. We create that gable end, and we'll have a look at it at the end here. So we've got some barge boards at the end of our gable. That happens by this last truss being slightly shorter than the rest, and outriggers spanning back to the next truss back there. So that's pieces of timber that are joined to this truss here and go over the top of that one, and they support our barge board that sticks out at the end. Beyond that, all of our trusses are exactly the same, and it makes for an incredibly simple, quick to install roof. Because all the builders need to remember is, okay, that truss and that truss are slightly different than the rest, they're just slightly shorter. All the rest we can just pick up whatever truss we want because they're all going to be exactly the same. Incredibly quick and simple form of construction. Gets a little bit more difficult when it comes to hip ends. Actually, well, I'll get into hip ends a little bit later. So, as I said before, very lightweight construction, large clear spans, open web construction is easy for the installation of services. With our conventionally pitched roof here that I've got, we have a lot going on. Yes, there's plenty of open spaces there, and for running air conditioning ducts, etc., we'll find ways to get those air conditioning ducts in there, but there is a lot going on. The thing about our timber trusses, if we look back to this one, we have very large open spaces, and those open spaces are all going to be in line with each other because the trusses are going to be all the same, except for when we get to our hip ends. So that makes it incredibly easy for designing services. We can go, all right, we're going to put an air conditioner here, like that, on the roof, and then run our duct all the way along. Makes it incredibly simple. For that, conventionally pitched timber roof is not as simple for that. We have to do a bit more working around. So incredibly quick to put up. There's that versatility of design. Yes, Anthony.
This truss, can someone, design to have an attic inside the truss?
No, pretty much. You can design trusses that do have large enough open sections. So, for example, if we really wanted to have an attic in a roof and we wanted to make it a truss roof, we could do, so this is our pitch roof like that, we could do a form of truss which is like this, and then we would probably have to do some form of webbing in there as well, probably straight up to there like that. So we'd have to form up trusses that are like this. That's the, it'd be something like this. I'm not a truss manufacturer myself, but that's what we would have to do to get an attic in there. That, although it's a very simple question, is actually, there is so much complexity built around that. The way that the National Construction Code deals with attics, non-habitable spaces, and habitable spaces, there are relationships for roof height as opposed to floor area, etc. It does get very difficult. Basic, and what that means, and I can't really cover this very quickly at all. What that means is that typically, to be able to get your 2.1 meters height, you need very large distances here, because we're talking about a very big element there, or incredibly high pitches, so very steep pitches, to be able to get the 2.1 meters height of that space there. So I'll just let you know there's a lot of complexity around designing, particularly spaces within roofs, and that will require a lot of working through yourself. It is possible with trusses. I tend to think it's going to be much simpler with portal frames. So, but then we still have some of these issues, etc. But yes, short answer, yes, can be done, but not simple. So trusses are held together with nail plates, and here we've got an example of one of these nail plates. Has everybody seen a nail plate before? Cool. So we know what they are. They just get pressed in the factory, and they hold it all together. So steel, once again, is fantastic in tension. Once you get that pressed into the timber in the joint, and there's tension put on there, it holds it all together. There was a very bad incident with a building at a golf course, probably about 15, maybe it's getting on 20 years ago now, whereby a whole series of trusses collapsed and several people were killed in the process. That is primarily due to the form of the nail plates. So this nail plate here, although we can't really see it in that picture very well, but the nail plates in that, so the nails are just punched out of the flat plate of steel, and they are square fingers like this. So they're punched out in a square fashion, and they press into the timber. The issue with the nail plates with the building that failed were that the nails were this shape, like this. So it was thought, okay, if we punch out triangular shapes, they're going to be much easier to press into the timber. But what happens with triangular shaped nail plates is, because trusses are designed to have that little bit of flex, and they flex all the time, they move a little bit all the time, triangular shaped nail plates end up working their way out of the timber. So with that little bit of flex over time, they work their way out, and then once they've worked their way out, of course there's nothing holding the truss together at all. And that's where the trusses can fail. So as part of my old job, whenever we would have to go into a roof space, we had to make note of what the nail plates were as well, in case there were any issues arising from that. So it was a bit of one of those, it was a big liability for the original truss manufacturers that used those pointed nail plates. So, a whole bunch of different types of trusses. Anybody want to have a guess at how long that truss is? Don't know that I know. Well, I don't know myself, but I can guess.
More than 15 meters?
It's probably not going to be more than 15 metres. I reckon 15 metres is about our cut-off for being able to be transported on a semi-trailer. But I don't know. I guess if somebody was laying down on that bed, that'd be about 1.8 long each of those sections. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Can't count them, but it would be probably about 13, 14 metres long, that truss. That is a very large open space to create, and that's what that's the fantastic thing about trusses, is they're just using pieces of 90 by 35 timber, so not very large pieces of timber. So look at our timber log, we get lots of 90 by 35s out of that log. So plenty of that timber available, but we can create very large spaces using those trusses. Other interesting things shown in these pictures. This one at the top, it's not that clear and evident, but there's something interesting happening with our bottom chords on this. So those trusses have a stepped bottom chord to create a two-staged bulkhead. Now, why the designer or the architect has decided on a two-staged bulkhead, I don't know, but that goes to show that such a feature is also possible with trusses. You can certainly achieve that with conventionally pitched timber framing as well, just not, I guess, not as simple and not integrated into that one unit. So still those trusses will go up very quickly. We have light gauge steel frame truss there, and if we look at our light gauge steel framing for houses in residential residential areas, that's pretty much what we would see. This truss happens to be what's called a truncated truss. So a truncated truss is a truss where the top has been chopped off. So chop the top off, make it flat on the top. The reason we would have, well actually no, I'll go into that a little bit later, why we have truncated trusses, but have a think about that yourselves. So that's our truncated truss, top's chopped off, and this one's what's called a bowstring truss. That's where we've got a curved top chord. So we don't actually have an apex to that at all. We have a semicircular curved steel section and then steel webs in between to create that bowstring. That is not going to be, well, it's possible with timber, but not very practical with timber. It's much better suited to steel. So a whole bunch of other interesting trusses. So here's some giant trusses being lifted up by a series of forklifts there. And some composite trusses. So we've got curved timber top and bottom chords and then steel webs in between. There we have some trusses that are called cantilever trusses. So what we can see right at the top of this picture is that the trusses, their ends don't mount on the timber frame. They're actually mounting partway through the truss. So let's say that's 900 millimeters into the truss. And to achieve that cantilever, those trusses have been designed with a vertical web straight up from that to transfer those compression loads from the roof straight through that web onto that wall frame. So we have this end section of the truss working in its own system. So we've basically got a triangle there to be able to cantilever out and take all the load of those tiles. So triangles, very strong shape. We've got that triangles there, and then we've got our truss back through there that's also working all as a single unit. So cantilever truss, that differs from a sailover truss. Now a sailover truss is where we've got our top chord that hits our top plate of our wall framing and then sails over to create a raked eave. So our cantilever truss creates what's called a boxed eave. This one creates a raked eave. However, we can go along and add some timbers into here to box the eave if we wish. So that all comes, but your truss manufacturer will want to know that information when they're designing your trusses. If we're going to be tying our top chords back to our frame, that is going to change the way that top chord interacts with the webs, and your truss manufacturer is going to want to know that. So a bit of truss terminology. So top chord, which are our rafter sections, bottom chord, which make up our ceiling joist sections, and webs that tie those two together to make them work together as a system. We'll go through that fairly quickly. We do have a lot to cover, so here we go. Now, I said I'd talk about hip ends. So with trusses, if you understand, so we've gone through our standard truss, our typical what's called A-type truss with a W-shaped web in there. If we understand our standard trusses, then understand how we form up a hip end with trusses, and then understand what's called saddle trusses. If we know all of those, then we can basically look at 90, probably 95%, or no, probably more than that, probably like 98% of trussed roofs, and know how every single member within that trussed roof works. And that's what we're going to try to achieve now, is to understand hip ends, and then I'll show you some saddle trusses. And then understanding that, you can look at far more complex roofs, but break them down into these simple elements. So with our hip end, so that's what we've got here on our example roof here. So rather than a gable end, which has triangles with the ridge carried all the way out, we've got hip ends, which are sloping ends to it. Very standard form of roof. You know, as you're driving home, have a look and see what roofs are hip ends, what are gable ends, and you'll also see some roofs with Dutch gables as well. That's where you've got a ridge which carries out part way, and you've got a small triangle at the top. But they make up the bulk of the forms of roofs that we see around. So our hip ends, the sloping ends, are a very rigid form of roof because these sloping ends provide some bracing within the roof as well. Also fairly simple to create with trusses. It just takes a little bit more ingenuity to step away from our standard A-type triangular truss. The way we create these hip ends is we've got our standard truss here, right at the apex. Then leading right up to that apex, we have our hip trusses. So those hip trusses, they're what form, well, they form the hips of our roof. And they are a triangular truss with a top chord that extends. The reason that top chord extends is because that triangular truss mounts onto what is called a girder truss. With our hip ends, we have what are called stations. So this is I guess you want to know this terminology when you're speaking to truss manufacturers. So if you've drawn a roof, and typically you will draw up a roof and you'll send it to them, they'll send you back the design, you check it, yeah, it works, great, send it off, and you won't have to have any discussions with them. If you do, and if you want to have some modification or talk about why they've done certain things because it doesn't quite meet what you require, some of the terminology you need to know is this with stations. So our first truss, well, right at our apex there, in our hip end, that's the first station, second station, third station, fourth, fifth, etc. as we go through toward the outside. So we start at our apex there. Almost exclusively, or entirely, our girder trusses are located at our third station. Sometimes the smaller hip ends, they're located at the second station, but the vast majority of times they're located at our third station. Our second and third station trusses are going to be truncated. That means the tops are cut off. The reason they're truncated is because they're fitting into that hip. So this one, this second station, is going to be truncated like that. And our third station is going to be truncated like that. So truncated significantly more than our second station. So that's our second station. So that's a standard truss. Let's call these 90 by 45 members. Our girder truss, which sits at our third station, may have members that are like 140 by 45. So much larger pieces of timber in there, and it's truncated even further. And then we've got some, webs in there, etc. The reason this girder truss is much stronger and heavier is because it actually carries all of that section of roof on it. So our hip trusses join up to our girder truss, and they place all their weight on the girder truss. Our creeper trusses, our creeper trusses join up to our hip trusses, which put all their weight on that girder truss, and then our jack trusses join up to our girder truss. So that girder truss is taking all the weight. Yeah, James.
Oh, I was just thinking about something funny.
All right, yeah. Is there something I don't know about trusses that you know?
No.
Yeah. So our girder truss is taking all of that weight, and because it's taking all of that weight, it needs to be a far stronger construction. And that term girder truss is not exclusive to hip ends. We see girder trusses throughout other areas, and girder trusses are not always truncated. The term girder, that just means that it's carrying a lot of weight. So we've got other trusses landing on it. So we'll go through this fairly quickly. Explore this to the extent of your own interest, basically. King post trusses, you'll see those in some very old buildings about the place, some sort of old warehouses and things like that, where we have really big pieces of timber back in the days when people were chopping down really big trees, and there was plenty of big pieces of timber around. Queen post truss is a little bit more economical with use of timber because we start introducing more webs. These king post trusses can only spans up to around about 5 metres or so. Queen post do up to about 6 metres. So the A-type truss, so A-type, that's got your W for the web. So that's your most common. And they're the ones you'll see in the vast majority of your residential builds, span up to about 9 metres. So typically we're not interested in spans longer than that in a lot of residential architecture. However, if we're creating some very large open spaces, then we can go to things like our B-type trusses, which have 2 Ws. So W on this side, W on that side for our web. So A-type's got the 1 W in there. B-type, it's W and W. They will span up to about 14 metres. So a standard girder can be based on any of these previous types, but is designed to be stronger to support other trusses. We pretty much stop at that generally for residential architecture, for the 2 reasons. People don't tend to build houses with spaces larger than 14 metres in an open section, or a house typically doesn't exceed 14 metres in width. As a rule of thumb, a lot of councils will allow building or allotment. So when you go carving up allotments, they will allow 13 metres frontage to the road. So 13 metre width of blocks, which is fairly typical, residential block size now. So older blocks much larger than that, but 13 metres width. So when we're talking about 14 metre spans of trusses, we're talking about fairly large buildings. But also transport plays a role in that as well. We're pretty much limited to 15 metres. You can go to 18 metres with some semi-trailers, but I think beyond that, you start needing police escort, etc. to get these vehicles to site. You don't really want to be paying for that or organising that if you can. Also, when you start talking about very large trusses, you have to crane these into site. A crane is going to cost about $500 an hour. Well, for your larger cranes, $500 an hour. Particularly if you're working in areas that are far away from the city, you've got to pay for that crane to drive down there and pay for that crane to drive back, and you're paying the same amount. So they're not cheap by any means. And also with very large trusses, you have to think about how you're going to manoeuvre that on site as well, how that gets about from the truck to the building as well. So truncated standard truss, and then truncated girder truss. So the difference here is this line is thicker. So thicker bits of timber, that's it. So cantilever truss, so that's what we saw in that other picture there, where our truss cantilevers out. A cut-off truss, so we might use a cut-off truss where we've got a parapet wall happening at the front, so we'll have a pitched roof, then have a parapet wall right up front here like this, for a shop front, or something like that, might be the go. Or we also might use that in a masonette example, where we've got two houses joined together by a common wall, like that, or a garage wall, something like that. So typically where that terminates against some sort of wall, we'd use a cut-off truss. And then half trusses, use that in a skillion roof, use those half trusses in a hip end to form jack trusses, etc. So half trusses all through the place, many scenarios. So we'll go through this fairly quickly as well, because I think I summarised that fairly well with our truss at the beginning. So timbers want to sag. So these slides are also organised around showing some of the conventional pitch timber framing in there as well, provide an example. Actually, I'll cruise through that because we're going to cover that a little bit later. So our webs transfer those stresses through other parts of the truss to make it all work together. Trusses can be designed with a slight upward camber. That slight upward camber means that when we apply the weights, so the construction weight to the building, it settles down to be nice and straight. That's preferable to designing a truss which is exactly straight, and then we apply, say, tiles, which are 90 kilograms per square metre, onto that roof and cause that roof to settle slightly, and we have slight curves in it.
So is that the only instance where you do it, is where you're doing a tiling? Because surely...
Yeah, sheet roof, you don't get that settlement. So, yeah, sheet roof without ceiling loads imposed, we're talking about 10 kilograms per square metre. So 10 kilos per square metre on those top, that's next to nothing there. You're not going to get a piece of 90 by 45 bendy with that. So it's really only with tile roofs that you want. Yeah. And that's part of the information you're going to have to supply to your truss manufacturer as well. So you give them your floor plans, you give them your roof outline, you give them your elevations so they can see what those trusses are going to be in elevation, and then you specify the roof type as well. For two reasons. One is that load, so they can design to counteract that load. The other is for wind loads. So steel roofing, sheet roofing doesn't have the gravitational loads that tile roofs have, but they have additional wind loads. Because air can pass through a tile roof slightly, we don't get the same suction on the leeward side. Whereas with a sheet roof, it's pretty much, well, it's fairly airtight, and so we get a lot of suction on that and a lot of ramping force from the wind. So the truss manufacturer is going to want to know that, because the trusses behave differently. So benefit trusses, they span long distances, and I covered this earlier. So internal walls cause problems if used for support, because they change the way the truss works. So the way we get around this, now we want our internal walls to be fixed at a slab. So our internal walls are fixed down at our slab here, but then we also want them fixed at the top, because we don't want walls that just, flap around and possibly fall over. So they need to be fixed to our trusses, but we need these trusses to work independently. Now we're only talking about very slight amounts of movement, millimetres if that, but still they need those millimetres to work. The way that we do that, and I'm just going to turn one of my nail plates into an L-shaped fixing. So our L-shaped fixings like this. In our L-shaped fixings we have accommodations for nails, which are long and skinny. So elongated holes, and then the nail goes in there, but that nail is not shot fired into there, so we don't use the nail gun for that, or we shouldn't. just hammer it in there and just leave a small little gap. So that L plate, so this goes through the bottom chord of our truss, and this is our top of our wall frame here, and that's fixed there like that. So that truss can move up and down ever so slightly, but that wall is still fixed in place. And so that wall can't topple over, that direction, or this direction either. So we've got our nail fixing through there like that. That's how we achieve it. That poses some problems when it comes to fixing cornices. So cornices, they're those little curved sections right where your walls hit your ceiling. Now, some modern architecture doesn't have cornices, and instead you have just a very fine gap, or like a 10mm gap, or sometimes no gap. But having that small amount of flexibility causes some issues there that we have to design around. One way of achieving that is we've got our plasterboard roof. Our cornice that goes in here like this is attached to our plasterboard, so with our cornice cement, but we don't attach it through here. So the cornice butts right up against that plasterboard, so you don't see any gap, but you allow that millimetre or so movement up and down without causing cracking and separation in that part there. Well, that's what should be done.
But painting would still.
Yes, yeah, painting would, but the thing is, you're not going to see that millimetre. Also, you'll see it when it's a crack. When you join your cornice to your plasterboard and you start tearing the paper and you get this uneven sort of line there, you'll see that. When it's a gap of, so you've got your eggshell white walls and your slightly off cream coloured base coat of your plasterboard, for a millimetre or so, you're not going to spot that difference. And typically, if you go around and look at construction in a really detailed fashion, you'll see lots of these tiny construction tolerances that you don't normally see unless you're really looking for it. So that's how you get around it. So that little line of painting, you're not going to notice it. So that's the way typically of achieving that. So that's some examples of those L-shaped brackets. Now, the way we fix our trusses right at the end is typically by using triple grips. Now, a bit of background to truss manufacture. There are two main suppliers of the materials for producing trusses. So if I wanted to build a truss roof, there's probably at least a dozen truss manufacturers I could go to in Adelaide. But of that dozen, they will either produce trusses for Prida or for Mitech. And both of those companies design all the steel fixings, all the plates, and ultimately those trusses. So you've got the truss manufacturer that you go to, but they will do it in accordance with the people that supply all of their stuff for producing those trusses. So because we have companies like Mitech or Prida that produce all of this truss stuff, they also produce those end fixings as well. So for anybody who knows Prida, does anybody know of that company, Prida Fixings? So good company to know or to understand. They produce a lot of metal products that are used in building. So all sorts of tie downs, steel lintels. They produce a lot of. So if it's steel and it's steel and small structural, so structural that's applicable to residential architecture, pretty much Prida have got that covered. So because they specify all the webs and they specify how those trusses are going to work, they will also say, well, you have to use our triple grips in the ends there as well. If you go, oh no, I'll just fix it with nails or I'll fix it with whatever I want, you're not going to be compliant with their specification. And if something were to fail, they'll go, oh, well, you didn't do this as we said, therefore it's not our fault, it's your fault, and you don't want that. So because of that relationship, typically we've got these, what do we call it, proprietary fixings used. So these fixings that are designed by these manufacturers. Yeah, keep going through that fairly quickly. That's just and that might be an English thing as well. So bottom truss bows upwards in winter. That's about the taking in of moisture of timber, and then that expansion of the truss associated with that. It's showing this, but really those movements are incredibly tiny and pretty much imperceptible. So we've got our roof trusses. We also have trusses for floors as well. So to be able to get floors in an upper story to span large distances, create those kitchen mills family areas that are 12 by 12, that's how we do that with floor trusses. So more for your own interest, whole series of trusses here. And this is our standard gable end, so just a whole series of triangles through. Although what we don't have happening in this example, unfortunately, are those outriggers that I spoke about. Someone's done just a very simplified version of that. And then our girder truss layout. Once again, something that looks a little bit complex, but is actually really very simple when we break it down into what we know now about hip ends and standard trusses. So there's a whole series of standard trusses in here. It's a bunch of hips, etc. What we are yet to cover are what are called saddle trusses. So saddle trusses are these tiny little trusses that mount on top of an existing truss roof. So we set all these major trusses in first, so for our major ridge, and then we form up the hip end, and then mount all these small trusses on top of that existing truss roof to create, or to carry that pitch of that section through. So saddle trusses are just trusses that sit on top of other trusses, basically. So there is a truss layout, which to the untrained eye can appear a little bit confusing, and unfortunately it's not really clear enough to read thoroughly. But all these little letters and numbers here, that just simply represents what type of truss. So it's like a little bit more of a complex IKEA diagram. So saying T1 goes here, T2 goes there, or these ones are all T1, and these ones are all T3, and this one's GT3, etc. So it's exactly the same principle. And once again, some seemingly complex floor plans and truss layouts, but when we break it down into individual sections, we can understand that fairly well. So we have half of a hip end here, so we've got a hip end truss with some creeper trusses on that, and then some girder trusses that come through to this major girder truss there that carry that, and so we have a cut-off truss in there. This blue one, we've got a cut-off truss there, or that red one's also a cut-off girder truss. A much clearer truss diagram. So here we've got all our J1 through to J5. They're our jack trusses, and that's mirrored exactly on this other side. So that J1 is going to be exactly the same as that J1, if the carpenters get their walls square, which we assume they're going to. So all of those trusses are going to be mirrored of each other, because that roof is the exact mirror of itself. And so these are all fairly standard. So C1, C2, C3, creeper trusses. H1, does anybody know what H1 would stand for? Yep, hip truss. Yep, hip truss number 1. And so the reason we have hip truss number 1 is because it's slightly different than our, well, that's a hip 1 as well, because that's exactly the same, but hip 2 differs slightly because it's no longer a sail over truss. At this point, it's slightly different, so that's a different, so we've got H2 for hip number 2, and then these minor hips here, that's H number 3. We've got all these S's, S1, S2, S3, S4, S5. Anybody know what those S's are for?
Saddle.
Yep, saddle trusses. So they're sitting on top of our major roof there. And then all these just the T, that's just for your standard truss. So that's truss 1, truss 2. Well, they're all truss 1s because they're all going to be exactly the same. These ones, the top chords are cut off because otherwise they would interfere with the ceiling plane once they're inside. So they're truss 2s. And then we've got TG2, so that's truncated girder truss number 2. The reason that we don't call our standard trusses ST1 is because that can get confusing with our saddle trusses. So although we refer to them as standard trusses, a good approach is to never use that term ST for a standard truss, because sometimes you'll have to use saddle trusses, and when you do, that gets confusing. So your S's, use that exclusively for your saddle trusses, and just T just for your standard truss. And that's it.
So your manufacturer of your trusses will actually do all of this? You don't have to do this yourself?
You don't have to do that yourself, no. You can do that yourself as an indicative design type thing. You're working through the design, you're thinking, okay, this is going to be possible, etc. You do it yourself. I've done it myself a bunch of times, but I know that I'll do it up, mock it up to see what's going to happen, and then send it off to the truss manufacturer, and they'll go, yeah, and they'll do it, and and they'll go, nah, we can work out a better way or more efficient way. So, yeah, typically you can get away with just producing your elevations and your roof plan, specifying any loads, point loads and things like that, solar panels, air conditioners, all that sort of stuff they want to know about, and then roof type, and then they'll do the rest for you. Which is great because then, any liability, it's straight onto them. If there's any failure and it's all been done as they said, that's straight onto them. So that's our truss roof. Now, in the other corner, we've got pitched roof framing. So, let's say, by and large, if we were to go like a battle of the technologies, pitched roof framing is suffering, but it's still very applicable, particularly if you're going to be working in any retrofitting scenario, and that is actually a very big area for building designers and drafters, etc., are to be working with buildings that already exist, be that doing additions, modifications, rectification work. There's actually a lot of that work in that. So our traditional way of producing roofs is about using rafters and then finding out how we can support those rafters so the rafters are not huge. What you may also see in many instances are like this building here. We have this back section here, which is all trusses. So that really simple section, that was done all in trusses. But then we've got something funky happening up this end here. Some sort of feature. It looks like it's a Tudor style house with a very high pitch and an exposed gable at the end. So to create that Tudor roof, the designer decided it's going to be much simpler just to pitch that section in timber. And you get those amalgamations of approaches as well within one single roof. Roof coverings. So we've got to know about what's going to go on our roof. And the two major competitors are our forms of tiles, and we can spend all day talking about different shapes and types and materials of tiles. Basically, you've got terracotta tiles and you've got cement tiles, and they come in various different shapes. Then the other main form of roofing is sheet roofing. So sheet roofing, that is just really thin steel so 0.42 or 0.38 millimeters, so not even a millimeter thick, so not even half a millimeter thick. That let's say it's 0.38. That 0.38 steel sheeting will get bent into a certain shape through what's called a roll former. So it starts off as a giant coil of steel, and you may have seen some of these coils of steel on the back of trucks. And that coil of steel gets fed into a roll former, and then it spits out roofing profiles like this. And the different shape that it gets bent into dictates how far that piece of steel can span, because these ribs give it strength. If it was just flat steel and we were to just put that 0.38 piece of steel, attach it to our rafters, and I go to walk on it, it will just bend straight away. That doesn't have any structure to it. Those ribs are what gives the sheeting its structure. So by and large, our most common is going to be this one, this corrugated sheeting, which is called custom wall. So there are two major types of roof covering. Go through this fairly quickly. So we know our hip roof, our hip and valley. So the difference between our plain hip roof is, for our plain hip roof, it has to be over a rectangular building. We can't have any re-entrant corners on that building. For a hip and valley, that's where we get two rectangles intersecting. So those two rectangles intersect, and this area here is called a re-entrant corner. Where we have a re-entrant corner, we have a valley. So that's our hip and valley. Sometimes we have a large rectangle for our floor plan and then a small rectangle intersecting. When we have a scenario like that, it's a broken hip and valley. That's where we have a major hip and major ridge, and a minor hip and minor ridge. So major is the big one, minor is small. Gable roofs, we already know, so that's the triangular end. So be it the gable on the front of a bungalow, the gable roof of a federation style building with the Dutch gable here, that scenario. Incredibly modern use of gable. So we're talking incredibly simple, minimalist rectilineal forms without ornamentation, without gutters, etc. Keeping that as simple as possible. That's a very current kind of approach. You'll see that in international architecture a lot. Just that very simple silhouette house shape used in a minimal sense, and then various other examples there. So Dutch gable or gambrel, in South Australia we just pretty much call them Dutch gables. Within this building here, this one we can see at the front here, that's our standard sort of approach in residential architecture with the Dutch gable, is that Dutch gable is used as a feature and they're fully enclosed. The history of the Dutch gable, that comes from South Africa. So Dutch living in South Africa built roofs and then included these gables in there that were open at the ends to enable air to go inside that roof and pull the warm air out. So you had both the slight breeze entering and then the venturi action of that breeze as it passes over the roof to suck the warm air out and keep houses cool without air conditioning. That purpose has kind of been lost in many buildings and not really understood, but the feature has stayed. So that's the the practical roots of what is now just an architectural feature. And skillion roof. So I spoke earlier of tropo designs. That one kind of looks pretty tropo design to me. This one right in the centre. But that's also very very modern, but not so minimal. So what the aesthetic there is built around, I guess, typically Australian vernacular, the type of materials that you would see used in older rural buildings such as corrugated galvanised sheeting and exposed hardwoods, etc. The skilly roof also it is used extensively on, although if anybody's sort of lived in the inner suburbs, Parkside, Unley, North Adelaide, all that sort of those earlier built areas where you've got simple cottages, so we call them symmetrical cottages with a hallway straight down the middle, rooms off either side. You can almost guarantee that if you lived in one of those houses, you would have had a skilly extension on the back of that as well. So you've got those standard sort of symmetrical cottages, and then that were built in about 1905. And then you've got the 1930s extension, which is a skillion roof, and then the 1960s or 70s extension, which is even lower skillion roof, etc. So also used in those scenarios for very cheap extensions. Another fantastic type of roof, so it's sort of bound up in the 1980s aesthetic, but I very much like them for their function and what they enable. It's the clear story roof, where we've got two skillion roofs intersecting with a load-bearing spine wall that goes through the centre. The function of this is twofold. So that spine wall through the centre, it is limiting, being a load-bearing wall. You have to have, it has to be load-bearing. You can't go moving that wall around. It has to sit through the spine of the building. But the benefits in that are that you can utilise masonry for that spine wall straight through the centre like that. Get the thermal mass right inside the building. So provide that thermal flywheel inside the building. Also, if this side here is the north-facing side, means that in wintertime you can get light directly into those back rooms. So you can illuminate the back of the building during winter and also illuminate this front area of the building well with natural light in winter. And then in summertime when the sun is overhead, both the back room and the front room are shaded. So very functional in, making a comfortable home with minimal energy inputs. So fantastic for that. And so, so a favourite with environmentally friendly building designers, this clear story type roof, but it is a little bit bound up with that 1980s aesthetic, which can be unpopular for some. Also, flat roofs. So very few roofs are actually flat. Well, they shouldn't be flat. They should always have a little bit of a slope somewhere because we get water on the top and we want that water to go somewhere. When we talk about flat roofs, we're talking about roofs with minimal pitch. So that's roofs with a pitch of 1 or 2 degrees. So just a very, very slight pitch. If you're going to be designing a roof with only 1 degree pitch, you will want to be very exacting in your details for the builder. You don't want to have any tolerance there in the height of purlins, etc. Because 1 degree roof pitch is really very little pitch, and we don't want to have water pooling in sections on the roof. 2 reasons: it may leak from that pooling, or it gathers dust and then forms mud, and that's a place where your roof is going to rust out. Also, when we've only got 1 degree pitch, we've got some issues with roof penetrations as well. So what's happening with moisture around those, and how we're going to do the flashing around those. So higher risk, but flat roofs do enable scenarios like this. A very, very interesting, sorry, look, I'm standing in front of these slides for you a lot. So very interesting, well, I find them interesting rectilineal forms in their simplicity. So it really provides a blank canvas for some amazing materials. I like that design approach where we've got really simple design but some fantastic materials to showcase. And flat roofs enable that because you end up being able to get that real simplicity of design. A bit more Australian vernacular is the bell coat roof. So that's the homestead style, where you've got a steep pitch roof for the main body of the house, and then a slightly lower pitched roof happening for the veranda. So this one here, so was that right hand side, right in the middle? That's your typical sort of bush homestead. And the reason, and there's very good practical reason behind that. So the really high pitch creates a lot of volume in the ceiling space. That volume enables all the hot air to rise away from the ceiling plane and aggregate right at the top of the roof there. So you're getting the heat away from your ceilings. So in the hot Australian summers, for people who moved over from England, didn't really like that. They wanted to get that heat as far away from the ceilings as they could. But then if you were to carry that really steep pitch down past the walls, then very quickly you've got roof in front of you, because with a really steep pitch, you can only have a very skinny overhang before those roofs start getting in front of your windows. And that's not a nice aesthetic in a building, to have that enclosed kind of feel of a roof that extends down past the height of your windows. So you have a much lower pitch for your verandas. That enables big, wide verandas, shading all the way around the house, but without interference or visual interference with those verandas in front of your windows. So, framing members, a little bit more about timber. Oregon's a fantastic timber. It's very lightweight, very stable, and the fixings fix really nicely into Oregon. So it's a fantastic timber to work with, but it's quite a bit more expensive than Pinus radiata. So radiata pine, that's what we grow down in Mount Gambier and all through Mount Crawford Forest and Kaipo, etc. It's all radiata pine. So radiata is going to be much cheaper than Oregon. So that's why it's used for the vast majority of buildings. But for some older buildings, back in the day when we were exporting a lot of wool, exporting a lot of sort of bulk of things, and then having ships come back with raw materials as opposed to cars or manufactured goods, we were bringing back a lot of Oregon from the States. So it's something that you will see within older buildings. You'll get up into some roof spaces, and it's that timber that is really splintery. You get splinters very easily from Oregon, and it can be a little bit furry on the outside, but it's a fairly light timber that is also relatively hard, relatively resistant to compression. With our roofs, in fact, I'll get our standard roof up here on this table in a sec. But the idea with a standard or conventionally pitched roof is that you enable those. You don't want your rafters to be really big pieces of timber. So once again, back to our log, we've only got very few very big pieces of timber within our log, and so we don't want to have all the rafters in our roof really big pieces of timber, because we're going to run out of timber otherwise. So we want to minimise the size of the rafters, and 90 by 45 is a really good construction size. If we can keep rafters down to 90 by 45, that's fantastic. It's really cheap. Typically around the $2 a lineal metre, sometimes a little bit less for machine graded pine. So $2 a lineal metre, that's really cheap, and that's got to be much cheaper than if we go to 350 or 380 or so lineal metre for a 140 by 45. So because we have so many rafters, a lot of that timber in the roof, we save a lot of money by cutting the size down. That is the main aim of this approach with conventional pitched timber framing. So I'll get our conventionally pitched timber frame roof up here and get you guys to come up and have a quick look at this and see how that works in practice. Okay? So I've mentioned rafters. And rafters are essentially our most common element within our roof. So these are all the sloping members that go from the ridge to the top plate and then to our fascia on the outside. So our fascia, that's this piece which is going all the way around the outside. That ties our rafters together and provides a mounting point for our gutters. If we didn't have fascia and we just attached our gutters onto the end of our rafters, our gutters would move around, etc., and would not be very stable, and would end up getting a roof gutter like this. So the fascia actually provides a structural component that stops the end of the rafters doing this, and provides a good mounting point for our gutter. So our rafters go up to our ridge. So that's our ridge plate, or ridge board, or ridge raft. There's so many different names, but basically they all have the word ridge in them. So that's our I'll call it our ridge plate. And then the size of our ridge plate is defined in the timber framing code as being the depth of the plumb cut of the rafter plus 50. So it has to be deeper than the plumb cut of our rafter. That's that angle cut of our rafter. It has to be 50 millimetres deeper than that by 45 millimetres thick. So first of all, we determine the size of your rafters, then that will give you the size of your ridge. Then we've also got our hips, and the dimensions for that is given in the timber framing code, basically the same, that it has to be deeper than the plumb cut of our rafters, and I think it's 45 again as well, but don't quote me on that. I can't remember all these things off the top of my head. But we've got our hips, and those sizes are determined by the timber framing code as well in there. Then off of our hips, we've got all of our, and the same as our trusses, so we've got creeper rafters, which go up to our hips, but then our rafter that goes right to the ridge there, supports our ridge, that's called our jack rafter. So jack rafter here, creeper rafters there, and these are all our common rafters. So it's like the truss is our standard truss, these are our common rafters. So to ensure that our rafters don't need to be too big, we want to break up the span, because the size of a piece of timber is determined by the weight that it carries and the span that it does from point of support to point of support. Now the ridge is counted as a point of support. The reason it's counted as a point of support is because we've got an opposing rafter. We've got a rafter pushing it up from this side, and then so that acts as a point of support for that, because our rafters are now in there. So to break that span up, so let's say we've got a span of 4 metres there. 4 metres, that's going to require a fairly large piece of timber. To break that up, we put in what's called an underpurlin. So we've got our purlins that go on the top, we fix our tiles to, or our roof sheeting to. These ones underneath are also going perpendicular to our rafters. They're called underpurlins. They provide support to our rafters. But once again, we don't want our underpurlins to be massive pieces of timber, because if we just accept, underpurlin's going to span from here to here and carry the midpoint of all those rafters, that underpurlin's going to have to be huge. That's probably going to have to be a steel beam. So to ensure that that is not too big, we need to strut that underpurlin at points. So we need to think about, where are our internal walls going to be? We go, got kitchen Mills family at this end, we've got our bathroom there, we've got our first bedroom here, etc. Let's put a load-bearing wall through here, let's put a load-bearing wall through there, like that, and then from those load-bearing walls, we can mount some struts. So those struts go straight from our walls up to the underside of our underpurlin and support our underpurlin. Typically, we're going to want to support our underpurlin at these ends here. That's what I always try to do in designing a roof. This one hasn't done that. I don't so much agree with that, because it's at these points here, at that cantilever, that's where you get a great deal of stress on the timber, because you've got this leverage happening. So I always like to try to get struts close to those hips, because then you really cut down on side underpurlin required. For an example,
I was just going to say, if you couldn't have a load-bearing wall here, that's why they would have put it back there, isn't it?
Yes, but there's a way you can get around that. And the way you get around that, Yeah, I'll get straight onto that. So these are our struts there. Now, when we have to go from point of support to point of support and we need to have a strut in there somewhere, we can actually introduce what we call a strutting beam. So that's a beam that goes from this load-bearing wall to that load-bearing wall, like that. It's a big beam, and then we strut straight to that. So we introduce a big beam here, but it means that this one can be smaller. So this one, let's say it's, we've got 12 metres or 80 metres or so of underpurling. If we introduce one short beam there that's only 2.5 metres or so, or 4 metres maybe, that's really big and thick, we still save on timber. So we can put a strutting beam in here. Now what they've put in here is what's called a hanging beam. Now the hanging beam hangs our ceiling joists. So like our rafters, if we have to have ceiling joists that go from this side to this side, that's a very long span of ceiling joists. So you end up having very big ceiling joists to do that. So the way to break that up is to have hanging beams that go across here, like that, help support our joists. If we can use that hanging beam also for strutting, to put a strut onto that, that hanging beam becomes a strutting hanging beam. It's that simple. And that's the way that I would have gone about doing this. I would have strutted those corners there off these hanging beams, but then that means that these hanging beams have to be quite large because they're both picking up the weight of the ceiling joists and strutting that underpurling as well. So we've got rafters, we've got ridge, hip, underpurling, struts. We don't have a strutting beam in here. Oh yes we do, here, this one here. Strutting beam. So we've got struts coming off a beam put in specifically for strutting. And then we've got hanging beams. Technically, I don't know if we've got a load-bearing wall under that. Let's say we don't, right? So then that one becomes a strutting hanging beam because it's carrying out ceiling loads as well. So we've got underpurling, hanging beam, strutting hanging beam, and struts there. Struts can come in two forms. One is our standard strut, so our perpendicular strut. That's running perpendicular to our underpurling. The other type of strut is the type of strut that we can see here, which is a fan strut. That fan strut has a point of support there, and then it fans out from that and provides support there and support there. That is exactly what I would use in that scenario as well. Fan struts, I like fan struts. They enable a lot of support without imposing a great deal of restriction with your floor, with how your floor can be used. So that provides support out to that sort of area and out to there. So what we end up having is we only have a cantilever of, let's say, 900 millimetres there in that scenario, whereas if we had just a single strut, that cantilever would be 1.2. It's also that cantilever, if it was just a single strut, is just rocking on that single strut. But when we've got a fan strut, it's got 2 points of support, and so it's sort of supported in two places there. So we still have that that rocking action happening at the base of our fan strut, but it's stabilised our underpurling much better. And so we have smaller cantilevers. So you can use those fan struts really to cut down spans. So here we have a strut and a strut. If we had fan struts happening here and there, then we only have very short sections of span for our underpurling in that scenario. So that's probably what I would have used in those as well as some fan struts. But this has been put together to provide examples of various different things. That's probably why. So beyond that, in here, we've got all of our ceiling joists. And this is what is called a coupled roof. And the bulk of all your conventionally pitched timber frame roofs are going to be coupled roofs. What makes it coupled is that the rafters oppose each other, and then each set of opposing rafters has a ceiling joist which joins them at the base, so it stops them spreading at the base. But then also, to stop them spreading part way along, you have the collar tie. So the collar tie sits just above the underpurlin, so it sits there, helps locate the underpurlin and tie that together as well, but then it stops the rafters spreading at the top as well. So we've got bracing in those two sections to stop the roof spreading. That stopping any spreading action of the roof is incredibly important, because if we do get spreading action of the roof, that just pushes our wall frames out like that. And there's nothing to stop our wall frames going. So our roof is actually what ties our wall frames together. So it's very important that the roofs are coupled. And I have seen some scenarios with roofs where, due to external ground movement and stresses being placed on sections, it's weakened collar ties and joist fixings, and the roofs have started to spread as a result. So very important feature of a pitched roof. Beyond that, so we've got all our ceiling joists. Those ceiling joists have got to be at 600 centres, because you only want maximum span of 600 millimetres for your plasterboard fixing. If you were to support that plasterboard at 900 or 1200 millimetres, it just sags like this between your points of support. So 600 mil. We've got to do something interesting at these ends here. There is no space to get a ceiling joist in there. So we need something to fix our plasterboard to right at this wall here, but you can't get a ceiling joist in there because these rafters are right there. So the way you do that is by having these intermediate joists run back to that first joist. So we'll see that, so we've got that happening at this end as well, because we've got the same scenario there. That's pretty much it for that roof. And if you understand those concepts, so this is a very simple roof, but if you understand that terminology and those concepts of what each of those members are doing, you can then apply that to your very complex roofs. Your complex roofs are just this on a more complex fashion. So it's exactly the same principles and components applied to a more complex scenario. And why do we want to understand how a conventionally pitched roof is put together and what all those elements do? Well, the reason we want to understand that is because if we are going to build an addition onto that house and put some extra roof load onto some bits, we want to know exactly how that weight is going to be transferred through that frame. What sections of the frame will need bulking up. Now, we can determine the size of all of our bits of timber in our conventionally pitched roof by using the timber framing code. So the timber framing code sets out how it should be put together and how it should be measured, and specifies some of these sizes for us, but then all the other sizes like our rafter, our underpurlin, our ceiling joists, we can decide what size they are within the limits of the span tables attached to the timber framing code. So we've got the timber framing code that tells us how to do it, and then it says you've got this whole series of span tables, and you can choose your size of timber based on those span tables. So it tells you this is how you measure the loads that are going on the roof, and then the span tables say this is the size piece of timber you need to resist that particular load and to enable that particular span. That's the whole process in a nutshell. The practice of that is actually quite a bit more complex and takes a lot of practice. So you'll sit down and you'll work through that. Unfortunately, in 20 minutes I don't have time to even provide, just a little snippet of understanding of the timber framing code for you to start using it. That's something you'll have to spend a lot more time on later on, especially if you do timber framing code as a subject. If you want to be working with timber, I definitely suggest that. But that's how we do it. And as designers, because we can design in accordance with the timber framing code, that gives us, a lot of design flexibility without having to refer to other professions. So we don't have to go to an engineer. So we don't have to go, all right, I want the house to be like this. Engineer, can you design that for me? Through the timber framing code, we can do that ourselves. So we've covered our timber members, so a bit of revision there, and you get this revision going through that section of slides I showed you earlier on as well. We've got our ridge, our underpurlin, strut, collar tie, ceiling joist. Now here it's called a pitching plate. I guess that's not incorrect, but typically we call that a top plate. So we've got our wall frames. The top piece of timber on our wall frames is the top plate. But pitching plate refers to any type of horizontal timber member which is carrying load. So we can have a pitching plate mounted on the side wall of a house to pitch a veranda off, for example. Yeah, we'll keep moving on. Then not a great deal to show in that. So we spoke about our hanging beams. Our hanging beams split up the support of our ceiling joists. Once again, some more terminology. That's probably going to be pretty hard to read from back there, isn't it? So once again, actually no, I won't keep going through today's lesson, but I ask that you go through that yourselves at home, and also the timber framing quiz will be something like this as well for you to do your quizzes at home. So that's our ceiling joists. We've got little hangers there. The rafters, the incline members of the roof frame, placed at 600 centimetres for tile roofs and 1200 centimetres for sheet roofing. 600 centimetres for tile roofs because our tile roofs are going to be much heavier, and we need to have short spans for our tile battens. They're the horizontal pieces of timber that our tiles sit on. Also, because our tile battens carry a lot of weight, even though they're making only 600mm spans, because they're carrying so much weight, we typically have to use hardwoods for that as well. So hardwoods, much stronger piece of timber, so we can use smaller sections. So it's typically 50 by 38 hardwood will span that distance. So rafters cut at the intersection of the top plate to seat the rafter, and it's called a bird's mouth. So this is our top plate, the top of our wall frames there. To ensure our rafters aren't inclined to just slip off the top of the wall frames, they're actually seated in. So when we design those rafters, we design them for, approximately 50mm plumb cut, and then whatever resulting seat cut from the angle of the rafters. Rafter overhang can affect rafter size. So with our rafters, we are concerned with that span from ridge to top plate, but a major determinant of our size of rafter is going to be our overhang. And that's one of the reasons why on modern buildings you see eaves that are absolutely tiny. So the tiny eaves doesn't work very well from a building comfort perspective. What it does work well in is building houses very cheap, because then we can really cut down our size of the rafter. Because a major determinant of that is the cantilever, the rafter that cantilevers. If we're going to have a 900mm overhang, that might mean that we have to use a 140mm piece of timber all the way through, which is going to almost double our costs of our roof. So that's why we have small eaves, but maybe it's worth still. I think typically in many instances it's still worth paying for that. So here is our rafter terminology and our top. Well, actually, no, we've got other components in here as well. So a hip rafter, creeper, broken hip, cripple creeper, rafter, jack rafter, valley rafter. One thing we haven't really covered with our very simple roof there, because it's just a single hip, is we didn't have any valleys in that. So with our valleys, we also need to have a rafter which goes up in our valley there as well. And any idea what else we would need to have in our valley there that we don't need to have on a hip? Yeah, spot on, yeah. So you're going to have to accommodate a gutter in there, and that gutter is going to have to be supported in some way. So what you have happening on top of your rafters there are some boards that will carry a very thin sheet gutter. So we've got thin metal sheet which forms a V gutter, and then that is supported on our timber boards that go straight down our valley there. Here we have it in here, so we have valley boards sitting on that. Another way to do very large spans of rafters without intermediate supports is to use engineered timber. So that does away with a whole lot of work on site, but for these engineered timbers you're going to be paying around $20 a linear metre, as opposed to about $2 a linear metre for 90 by 45 MGP10. That is the difference. So you're going to spend 10 times as much on your rafters, but you also then have no load-bearing sections within your rooms, and it's going to operate much like a trussed roof. So yeah, we know all about hips and valleys. So valley gutter boards. Here is a cross section through our valley. So we've got our valley rafter happening there, and then our creeper rafters coming down to our valleys, our purlins to support our sheeting, and then our valley boards to support our valley gutter. And this valley gutter is folded at the ends to ensure that any water that gets up there is not going to be, well, any water that's sitting high in that valley is not going to be blown by the wind and get passed into our roof space. So we want that return on the top of our valley gutter as well to help catch any water that might be blown by wind. Our underpurlins, they sit on top of our rafters, they sit underneath our rafters and help the span of our rafters. So they cut the span of our rafters typically by half. Roof struts. So here we have a series of perpendicular struts, and in this picture we can see what is definitely a strutting beam. So we've got an underpurlin here carrying the weight of our rafters, and our struts going straight off this strutting beam here. A keen eye might be able to pick up some hangers from that. If this is also supporting ceiling loads, then it's a strutting hanging beam. Also, the invention of engineered timber, LVLs, etc., have made all of this much simpler as well. And I said earlier that you can size up all of these members in accordance with the timber framing code. You can also do it in association with both the timber framing code and design programs that are put out by timber suppliers. So there's a timber supplier based out in the southeast who cut a lot of the forest down there, produce a lot of the MGP10 for framing, but also many of the engineered beams. They're called Carter Holt Harvey, so a very large company. They produce a program called Design IT, which if you calculate your roof load areas and put those details into their little program called Design IT, you can download it for free. It doesn't take up a huge amount of space on your computer. Get that on there, because then you can punch in the numbers and that will design all of these beams for you. In fact, you can use it to design the whole roof. Much of your rafter spans and things like that, if you know your way around the timber span tables, it's quicker to use the timber span tables for just your simple stuff. But for your more complex stuff where you've got multiple loads, and particularly if you're doing strutting hanging beams, so beams that are taking a lot of load from the roof, then also picking up ceiling loads. They're going to be large pieces of timber. Typically they're going to be much cheaper to do as an LVL, and you can size up those LVLs with that program as well. I think it's probably not too far in the distant future that programs like that specify all our pieces of timber will be associated as patches with our drawing programs, be it Revit or CAD or something like that. You design a house frame and then you've got this program as a patch on that goes, well, these are all the pieces of timber you need to do that and design that. But for the interim, as designers, we still need to work through those various things and do those roof load calculations ourselves. So, perpendicular struts are these ones that go perpendicular to our underpurlins. We can also use vertical struts, so that's struts that are straight up and down. There is a little bit of overturning action that happens with a vertical strut because your roof loads are not always directly down. Because we've got our rafters on an angle and we've got gravitational loads, it pushes slightly in as the rafters want to bow. So there are limits to vertical struts, and perpendiculars, typically more preferable, but it always depends on where your load lands. And that is all set out in the timber framing code as well. Your parameters around the angles you're allowed to put your struts. So if you're going to be designing struts, have a look at the timber framing code to see what angle of strut I can use. So perpendicular struts fixed at an angle not exceeding 35 degrees and perpendicular to the rafters. Also another interesting aspect of the timber framing code, you're not allowed to go to really steep, or the timber framing code cuts off at, I think, 35 degree pitch of roof. So 35 degree pitch of roof. When we go beyond that, for doing Tudor style roofs, for doing roofs that accommodate attics, etc., then that goes beyond the bounds of the timber framing code. And so, with our perpendicular struts, fixed at an angle not exceeding 35 degrees, well, that's always going to fit in with the timber framing code anyhow, because we're not going to have roof pitches steeper than that. If we do have roof pitches steeper than that, that requires an engineer to design those roofs. And fan struts used when strut angle exceeds 35 degrees, but not 45 degrees. Another strut is used at an opposing angle and fixed with a spreader. Yes, but no. So as I said before, fan struts are also quite often used to be able to spread out our load as well. So it makes use of our limited strutting opportunities to break up our spans of our underpurlin, and that's typically where I use them, rather than in that scenario. So there we go, a picture of a fan strut with a spreader used to tie that together. Some retrofit options for if we're going to impose additional loads at a later date, be that a solar hot water service. So, solar hot water service with our solar collector and then, 100 litre storage on there, is going to produce a pretty substantial point load. So if we've got a sheet roof, so a roof that's designed for 10 kilograms per square metre, and then put 100 kilograms on that square metre, we're drastically changing the way that roof works and the loads on that. Some ways of getting around that are by doing things like tie bolt trusses, etc., to increase the span of our underpurlins or spread that load between different points. Once again, that scenario needs to be designed by an engineer. It's not the sort of thing you would just want to go, oh yeah, I'll do a tie bolt truss in here, I'll whack it in, and if it fails, you're the one liable for having specified and or installed that tie bolt truss. So I don't suggest it. But Yeah.
Sorry, can I just ask, like, when people are installing solar panels and all sorts of things onto the roofs these days, do these sorts of things? No.
And yeah, and that's it's a grey area. I don't really understand. I installed solar panels for a while as well. I probably should have asked the guy who ran the company how they get around with it, but I'm pretty sure that that they don't go through council, they don't go through the whole design for additional loads on that roof. I don't know that it's become a major cause for concern, because solar panels are not super heavy. Like solar hot water services are very heavy. They're very much point load because they're storing that water in there. Solar panels, they're around the 10 to 12 kilograms per 750 wide by 1500 long. They're not all that heavy. Like you can pick them up like this and carry them on. And those panels, they're installed on large aluminium beams with lots of supports onto all of your rafters, so that solar panel installation is spread out, the weight is spread out over the whole system. So there's not really a point load, and then you've also got that additional two aluminium beams which your panels are supported on that sort of ties that together. So yeah, it's not really an issue. Technically, that should be considered, how that's going to change the performance of the roof, because if the roof fails as a result of those solar panels being installed, well then the solar panel installer is the one who's liable for not having gone through and had that assessment how it will affect. But yeah, as far as I know, it doesn't get done. So in final 3 minutes, so strutting beams. We determine the size of a strutting beam by the square metres roof space that it supports. So our square meterage of roof space is determined at midpoint between the ridge and the strutting beam, well, midpoint and the ridge and the underpurlin, sorry, and then once again midpoint of the underpurlin and our top plate, and then midpoint between our position of strut and midpoint between our other position of strut. So that strut is carrying that load of roof there. So the other loads of roof are covered by our ridge or our top plate, or by this strut or by that strut. That's how we calculate it. That's how the timber framing code specifies. We determine how much weight is on that strut. And when we know how much weight is on that strut, we go, okay, this is the span of our underpurlin. It needs to be this size to be able to achieve that span with that amount of weight on it. Counter beams, that's something we didn't see in our example roof. They're used to support one end of a hanging beam or at midpoints of hanging beams. So counter beams may also be used to support hanging beams and struts. They are referred to as combined strutting counter beams. So we've got our hanging beam that goes across here and supports our joists. And then to help support that hanging beam, we introduce another piece of timber called a counter beam. Keep flicking through. That hanging beam can be supported by our counter beam using a detail like this, where we have our counter beam and it's got two fixing blocks here, and the hanging beam sits on those fixing blocks and then is mounted into our counter beam there. We covered combined strutting hanging beams earlier. Bracing. So our roofs need to be braced against the racking forces of the wind. should be designed in accordance with the timber framing code, and it's not the type of thing that you end up designing straight out from TAFE. It's the sort of thing that you'll design once you've got a good working knowledge of house frames and the timber framing code. So, yeah, in the engineering office, yeah, it was expected that, after time I would, just be specifying or drawing in bracing for these particular frames, but it takes time to actually understand exactly how that bracing should go in and how it should be designed. And the reason we want to have that underpinning knowledge is because bracing is the type of thing that stops the whole building going. So we can have failures of certain sections of the building because of underspecified sizes of timber, but the bracing is what stops the building actually going one way or the other. It has a very important role. So it is typically steel strap fixed at locations because steel is very good in tension. It stops that building moving sideways and twisting. Purlins, so we've covered purlins. Sometimes we have composite systems where we have timber rafters, but then steel purlins on the top. And eaves. We've just covered eaves very, very quickly. So that's the overhang of a rafter. With a raked eave scenario like this, we are limited to our overhang. But if we box our eave like this, so we have our rafter tied back to our wall frame with a soffit bearer, creating this triangulation, it makes that section much stronger. And because it makes that section much stronger, we can have a larger cantilever on there. And that is one of the main reasons why you typically see a flat edge to your eaves. You'll see boxed eaves on probably 80% of the buildings that are built. So that's a raking eave, and that's the details around a raked eave. As you can see, it's all hand drawn. This is technology that hasn't changed since Adam was aboard. Gables and verge overhangs. I'm sorry, I'm just going a couple minutes over time here. I'll try to wind it up as soon as possible. But this is what I wanted to show you in regards to those trusses earlier. So this is not a trussed roof, but those outriggers, how that works is exactly the same with a pitched roof as it is with a trussed roof. This is our end truss here, if that were a trussed roof. That one's going to be slightly shorter than these trusses because we have outriggers that go over the top of it and fix back to our next truss in, so our first truss in. That creates that gable overhang, and that's how we achieve that. Very simple to remember how large we can make that gable overhang is it's the 1/3, 2/3 rule, and you'll see that in timber framing a lot, that the overhang is allowed to be 1/3 of, half of the backspan of that piece of timber. So 2/3 of that piece of timber has to be backspan, 1/3 can be cantilever. So if our rafter spacing there is 600 millimetres, then we can have a 300 millimetre overhang. If it's 1200 millimetres sheet roof, then we can get that up to 600 millimetre overhang. And that's one application of 1/3, 2/3, which you'll see a lot through the timber framing code. And that's it for timber structure. Essentially what we haven't covered are timber floor systems and timber versus steel wall framing. I'll try to weave that in at some point as well, but it is getting a little bit squeezy with what we have to cover and how much time we have to cover it as well. Actually, I'll squeeze those in at some point, but they should be very quick because the principles that we apply to our timber framing are very much the same principles that we apply with our light gauge steel framing. The difference is one has studs or sections made out of steel, one's made out of timber. And the steel frames have to be designed by the people who manufacture the steel. The timber, we can design that through the timber framing code. So, thank you very much again for your attendance. And any queries or questions and things in relating to assignments or today's lecture?
When's the site visit due?
I can have a look. So, 20th of June, is it?
Yes,
8th of June.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it was, yeah, so that's...
Done much.
yeah, is anybody... So, yeah, so site visit, 8th of June. Research assignment number 1, 13th. Oh, that's the one that's already been handed up. Research assignment 2, portfolio, 1st of June. So the research assignment is the one that's due before the site visit. Has anybody been able to make it onto site yet? You have? Have? Awesome. Yeah, cool. So that's a fair chunk of you. For those who haven't, look, I'll start keeping an eye out for sites around here as well. If I've got time, I'm absolutely flat out with work outside of TAFE and work inside TAFE. But if I can see a few sites located around here that I can line up access to you for, I will. But please get onto that as well. So any other queries in relation to assignments, etc., or how you're tracking? Okay, thank you very much,
Thank you.
everyone. We'll see you next week.